I am going to talk to you now about the post side of things. So we've covered off production. I even managed to talk a little bit about pre-production, some of the things that I might think about in advance of a shoot. But now I want to focus on what we do when we get this stuff back, and specifically going to be looking at a piece of software called DaVinci Resolve. Now, hands up if you've never heard of DaVinci Resolve. Okay, less than half, that's good. DaVinci Resolve it's made by a company called Blackmagic Design, and it's professional finishing software. So it's designed for, it's an editor, it's a color grading suite. The latest version's got some amazing audio finishing tools in it. You can use it on set for DIT work. DIT would involve taking rushes from cameras and creating dailies on set to hand off to the editor. It can also be used in conjunction with DP to generate LUTs to run into the camera or into monitors on set. So it's a fantastic piece of software. The most fantastic thing about it is that it's free, which sounds kind of crazy, and it sounds a little bit like there might be a catch, but it's genuinely, there is a free light version of it. It doesn't have all of the features of the full version, but the features that it doesn't have wouldn't necessarily be relevant to certainly one-man bands or small production companies. It's pretty full-featured, and so it's definitely something that if you like the look of it and like what I show you can do with it, then there's literally no reason why you can just download it and use it tomorrow, because it's free. Now, I use it pretty much on every single project because as much as I try my best to get things right in camera, and I really do try. I mean, Ollie, who's on the A-cam over there at the moment, and busy working for me, so he can't defend himself, which is a perfect situation. He's actually one of my students from the film school that I teach at in Bristol. And he would vouch for the fact that I have a bit of a reputation for nagging the students about getting white balance set properly in camera and going on and on and on about it. And everything I showed you in that last demonstration is 100% not made up for your benefit. I genuinely use this chart on everything. In fact, the whole reason that I have a relationship with X-Rite is because they saw a video tutorial that I made about this chart. And they saw that video, they approached me. So I use it on absolutely everything. And the reason for that, and the reason I nag my students, and the reason why I'm always got it with me on all of my shoots, and I genuinely have the passport version as well with me at all times, the reason why I have these things is because I know how painfully slow and just a massive roadblock it can be dealing with bad images in post-production. So even though DaVinci Resolve is an amazing tool, as a color grading package, it's just used on everything. There was a time where, people were mainly using competing products, but when they made it free several years ago, it's just everywhere. It's used on loads of TV. Plenty of films have been finished with it as well. Even though it's an incredibly complete and fantastic tool, if I can minimize the amount of time I have to spend in it correcting problems in production, then I'm going to do that. In the same way I told you about getting your audio levels to peak at -6, you do that because that's what you want to deliver it at. So if you can get it in camera the way that you want it when you deliver, that means that your pipeline is flat. It's easy, it's a straight line. However, I believe there's an expression, shit happens. Adrian was worrying about bugger, and I've come out with the S word. I'm so sorry, but there is a very well-known expression that shit happens, and it does. And it always is going to be the case where there's a shoot where you can't plan to the nth detail, and you can't quickly throw in a chart when you wanted to. And particularly in terms of white balance, it may well be that you've done it, but half an hour's gone by and there's a lot of natural light in the environment you're in, and the sun's gone out, or various things will affect the colors of your image. And so that's where tools like this come into their own. And knowing how to operate them and knowing how to get the best out of your images is the missing piece of the puzzle. And for a lot of people, the problem is they don't even necessarily realize that it's a missing piece. They think they have all the pieces for their puzzle. And I see it time and time again with people who have produced just incredible work, just beautifully shot, beautifully edited work, and yet the color consistency isn't there. And it immediately pulls your viewer out of the moment. Just like a bad actor will pull you out of a film and not make you want to sit there and watch it or believe what they're saying. Just like bad lighting or bad wardrobe or bad set design or bad camera work, all of these things, if they're just not quite spot on, your viewer just suddenly just recedes and disappears and they're not engaged anymore. And color is one of those sort of, it almost feels like the last kind of untapped part of film production. It's changing rapidly, and that's mainly because tools now are available for free, readily accessible, and relatively simple to learn as well, that are helping redress that balance. But for a long time, I've seen a lot of otherwise fantastic work that's been let down by inconsistency of color. One of the worst things, actually, and I spoke at a wedding event recently. I've never shot or graded a wedding in my life, but I was invited to come and talk at an event specifically for wedding cinematographers. And I kind of said to them, look, you've got the worst of this, because pretty much every single shoot, you've got people in white dresses or black suits or whatever it might be. There's lots of white, and if those whites, which we can spot so quickly, Adrian touched on this earlier, where our brains will look for these areas to judge and balance our imagery, what we're seeing. If you've got that appearing in shot after shot after shot over a 20-minute or whatever it might be film, whatever it is, your brain is going to really easily spot if those things aren't consistent. So DaVinci Resolve is going to allow us to deal with those problems. And one of the first things that you would want to do is create a primary balance, a primary grade to your image. Now, a primary grade is a grade that goes across your whole image. So it might be a contrast adjustment to the image, it might be a color adjustment or a saturation adjustment, but they're changes that affect the whole image and broadly push and pull it into an area where it's starting to look balanced and neutral. And that may be all you do, because if your film only demands a balanced and neutral look, which actually most do, then your job's done. So you may well just do a primary adjustment, export, forget about it, that's your film done. Again, people too often sort of jump straight to these kind of extreme looks and these creative looks and pushing kind of orange and teal into shadow. That kind of thing has its place, but again, it needs to serve the narrative, as we were talking about before. But a primary adjustment is going to be the first thing you do, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to do it, and I'm just going to start off by showing how I use the color checker chart to help me do a quick primary balance. So these color chips on the board are there for a very good reason, and I have a shot here. Hopefully everyone can see that. Is that light bleaching this out a little bit, or is it okay? Let me just turn it away a little bit. Is that worse? Turn it off. Turn it off, Ollie. Crikey. Is that better? Sorry about that. So you can see the chart, okay. So you don't have to use two charts. Funnily enough, this was B-roll for a tutorial about how to use these charts that I did for X-Rite. So I found myself not needing to shoot the chart for that because the chart was the subject. Very weird. Anyway, it's like stepping into a parallel universe for a moment. But there are, in fact, two charts here. We only need one of them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the tools that are in this program to allow you to create a balanced and neutral primary graded clip. So this scene, I have this one chart for. So the chart was popped into this scene. The scene itself encompasses all the B-roll shots that I shot of this, and then there's another chart somewhere in the world. It's not here right now, but there's another chart of me holding it for the interview, the piece to camera I did for the tutorial. So that's two charts that actually are good for the whole. I was shooting for probably about an hour and cut a 7-minute tutorial out of it. So that's only two charts. So sometimes I think people worry. I had a couple of you come up to me in the break like, oh, but what if I don't have time to do this? Actually, you find time to balance your tripod and set it up properly. You find time to expose properly. I think it's just working it into your workflow is the biggest challenge. But this chart, if I get it right, I can actually take a snapshot of the correction I've made to it, and then I can apply that incredibly quickly to everything else that needs that correction applied to it. So it's a very simple step. There are, in fact, some built-in tools. I'm just going to create a timeline for this to work from. There are actually some built-in tools that will allow you to do this automatically. And I have to say, this is one of those times where people like to demo this feature because people go, "Yay, it's easy." But in truth, I find that the automatic way of balancing out these charts is never, ever as good as if I do it myself manually. It is quick, and so if you are maybe you're on set doing some DIT work, you're generating some balanced LUTs for a camera or a monitor on set, you've got very quick turnaround to do that, then this will get you most of the way. But the manual approach, which I'll show you, once you get good at it, is only a little bit slower, but is much, much more precise. So let's start off with the automatic way. So I'm in the color page at the moment. There's actually only four main areas of this. I'm in the color page, and I've gone to the second tool in. The first one's for RAW adjustment. So if you're shooting RAW, which yes, you can do with video, you need a lot of hard drive space, but you can shoot RAW. You can actually make RAW adjustments to your video in there. But I'm now going into the second section where I'm going to be making some color adjustments. This is a primary adjustment, as I said. And the first thing I need to do is I need to choose what type of chart I've used. And Blackmagic Design, who make this software, have integrated support for these different charts. And you can see the X-Rite color checker passport here, and then there's the full-size video one there. I could actually with the manual approach, I could use either of these because I can just about see all the chips I need. But actually, for this one, I would need to use the passport one because that's the only one that I can see all of the chips. You can see I'm just obscuring that black one there, so I need to use the passport one here. And it doesn't matter that it's upside down. You'll see that this doesn't match that. This appears to be upside down. It actually doesn't matter. It's clever enough to figure that out. And there's a simple tool in here called Color Chart. And that lays a simple window over the top, which I can then use to line up with these. Let's get it roughly so that those squares are in the middle of the color swatches. Roughly there, he says. And I choose a source gamma. One of the problems with this demo, it won't work very well, is because I've forgotten the gamma that I shot this originally in. I'm pretty certain it's Rec 709, but I can't quite remember. But in theory, you would know what source gamma you shot at. Someone asked me about gamma in the interval of differences between S-log and C-log and Rec 709 gamma and all these sorts of things. It's a real can of worms, and it's definitely not something that I can talk about in 15 minutes. But I would happily take that conversation offline. If people do have questions about that, which I'm sure a lot of you do, because it's a big old minefield, feel free to drop me emails afterwards, because I think it is a big problem for a lot of people, and I'm happy to help with that. But suffice to say for now, I remember more or less that it was Rec 709. The target gamma would also be Rec 709. So with the color space, so this is pretty straightforward so far. The only other thing is to try and remember what the color temperature was on the day. Let's, for argument's sake, go with 6,500. Assuming you know all that information and it wasn't something that you shot 18 months ago and can't quite remember, all you have to do is line up the little window and just hit match, and it will analyze the differences between what you've recorded in camera and what it knows that value to be. And this is the important thing about these charts. They are known values. They're 100% repeatable Pantone printed colors that will be the same on every single chart ever printed. That's what you're paying for with these devices. And it knows from its internal library what that should look like. It compares it to what it's got on screen, and it shows you the differences, and it corrects for those differences. So for example, my exposure is pretty darn good. You can actually see that most of this is 0 or 1s, but you can see how it starts to drift out in certain colors, particularly around the reds. There's definitely some issues there, and sort of around cyan as well. There's like a 5, 6, 7% difference there. Actually, that doesn't surprise me. Once you do this often enough, you start to learn about the nature of your camera and the color science of that camera. And I certainly know only too well now what Sony's look like and the kind of things that you tend to get from them, and then the Canons, the way they tend to look. And you kind of essentially build up this kind of fingerprint library, if you like, of what these cameras and what they produce, what it looks like. In fact, what I'll show you when I'm doing the manual way is literally like using the vector scope to literally generate a kind of a thumbprint from that camera and correct those differences out, and you can actually use it to essentially hardware calibrate your camera by generating LUTs from it, which I'll show you in a moment. But this is a relatively quick, close enough automatic way. You can see that this is relatively close. You know, there are quite a lot of this, particularly in terms of exposure, that's not that different. That's not because of chance. That is because I've used the chart to get the exposure right. So I've used the zebras, I've used the 90% reflectance chip in camera to expose it properly. That's why it is so close. It's a bit like reminds me of those old dandruff, you know. But you don't have dandruff. I know. It's not done very much because I did it properly in the first place. If I hadn't have done it properly in the first place in camera, this could well have been like 20-30% difference between all these colors, and it would have had to really push and pull that around to kind of get it where it should be. Now that opens up a whole separate discussion about the integrity of your codec and what codec you're shooting with, whether it's 8-bit, 10-bit, 12-bit, whether it's 420, 422, 444, all these different technical considerations about the quality of the codec you're shooting with. Because if it's straight out of a DSLR, most of us, loads of people seem to be talking to me about DSLRs. I know I use DSLRs a lot on my shoots. You know, most of them, with literally only one exception I can think of off the top of my head, shoot 8-bit 420 internally. And that is a very compressed codec in terms of color. There's lots of information that's thrown away. And so if you don't get it right in camera, when you push and pull it and beat it up to get it right in post, it's immediately starting to fall to pieces, and you're actually losing image fidelity. You're using up all your chances essentially to kind of get it where it needs to be. So I shot this with an A7R2, in fact, so I knew I had to get it right to make my life easy in post, but also because if I had to fix it, it would start to fall apart, because that is only an 8-bit codec that we're working with. So that's one of the ways that you can approach this. Now, the other way that I can approach this is I can do it manually. So I'm just going to I'm going to leapfrog over some of these. I'm going to jump to my scopes. Now my curves. My curves are, initially you're presented with a pretty traditional type of curve. We've got, they call it the custom curve, you know, so this would be where I could adjust contrast or split out the different channels. I'm actually going to ignore this one because there are quite a few other different types of curve adjustments that you can do in DaVinci Resolve. And the ones that are the most exciting, the ones that you can just do incredibly quick corrections with, are the hue versus hue and hue versus sat ones. Now what that means is you can identify and isolate a hue, and then take that input value, hue, and change it to a different thing. So if you want to change it to a different hue, that's hue versus hue. If you want to take that hue and change its saturation, that's hue versus sat. If you want to take that hue and change its brightness, that's hue versus lume. There's lume versus sat, which is great for isolating shadows or highlights and then pulling out the saturation out of them so that you can clean up any slightly contaminated shadows or highlights with color casts. And then there's sat versus sat, so isolate a specific level of saturation. You know, it might be that you're shooting like a crowd scene and someone's got a fluorescent pink jacket on that's standing out like a sore thumb. You can click on it, isolate anything that's in that ballpark of saturation, and then just pull down that specific area of saturation. These are actually what's known as secondary adjustments. So I'm isolating a portion of the image and just manipulating that selection. So it's known as a secondary adjustment. But I'm using it in this context to create a primary adjustment, which is kind of unusual, but you'll see why in a moment. So I'm going to start off with hue versus hue. And these, in fact, it's easier to do it here. These charts have two different rows of color chips. So we've got a saturated and a desaturated set of primary and secondary colors. So we've got our primaries, the red, green, blue. We've got our secondaries, the cyan, magenta, and yellow. And as I said, it knows what those should be. Those should line up very specifically with an area that we can identify And the easiest place to identify that is in our vector scope. So I've loaded up my vector scope in the bottom right-hand corner here. I'm just going to zoom in so you can see it a bit. And I'm just going to turn on a few options. So I'm going to first of all zoom in. What that will do is, instead of, let's turn this on so we can see it, instead of the outer boundary of the vector scope representing 100% saturation, which things never are in video, in fact there are legal limits on how saturated things can be, by zooming up by 2 times, essentially this now becomes a 50% boundary. And more importantly, those boxes which are labeled R, M, B, C, G, Y, so those are your primaries and secondaries, they line up, or should line up, exactly with the colours, the saturated colours on your chart. Now, when you've got something like this with obviously lots of other colours in it, in fact I've got 2 charts, which is kind of confusing, I'm going to see blobs and splatters all over the place, or traces to give them their proper name. So I'm just going to brighten this up a bit so we can see it a bit easier. And probably that one as well. That looks better for you. So I need to isolate those colours. Because I'm talking through this, it's going to feel like, wow, this is a lengthy process, Ollie. You should have just done the automatic one that you showed us a minute ago. But genuinely, in reality, when you're not having to talk an audience through it, this takes probably 60 seconds. So what I'm going to quickly do is I'm actually going to use a mask. They call them power windows, which sounds really impressive, but they're just masks. And I'm just going to very quickly, I'm going to use the bigger one because it's easier to see. I'm very quickly going to draw a simple rectangle around these points. And the important thing is, because all that does is draw some white lines, that doesn't help us. What I need to do is isolate that and make everything outside of that mask selection either black, white, or grey. In fact, it uses grey. I'm just going to use this little magic wand here. It's called highlight mode, because it's allowing me to highlight specifically that area. And because the rest has now gone grey, that essentially means that it's disappeared from my vector scope, because grey has 0% saturation, and 0% saturation is that point in the middle of our vector scope. So essentially, we've cleared everything out, and we're left looking at only the traces that pertain to those saturated chips. And you can see, this is the thumbprint that I was just talking about. This is the unique sort of heartbeat, if you like, of the Sony A7R II in a Rec 709 Gamma. If you do it often enough, you start to see this pattern over and over again, and you start to see things like the magenta and the cyan being not quite right. And in fact, you know, I know other cameras where the magenta is really weak or very close to the red. You know, and it's the color science, it's the actual image processing pipeline of that camera and how it post-processes the raw data is unique to each manufacturer. They all have their own little secret sauce way of dealing with it. And what's cool about this is that this is it. This is it kind of borne out. This is the living, breathing proof of that color science and how it's different from camera to camera. So if you are shooting an interview multicam, and they're not exactly the same camera, or not even the same manufacturer, you can, if you've used a chart, you can look at this and you can actually see those differences right there in front of you. But more importantly, you can pull them out and you can correct for them. Now, if you really know what you're doing, you can actually drill down in camera and create custom picture profiles in the camera and correct for these types of problems, shall we call them, these weaknesses. And you can actually create image, picture profiles that you can load up in camera to kind of create almost like a hardware calibration in camera. But here I'm going to do it with the software in post. So the first thing I need to do is I need to isolate each of these different colors so that I can manipulate them individually. And you can see my hue versus hue has from red through to red again. So it's essentially a color wheel that's strung out in a line. But I don't need to sort of randomly click along here, and I don't need to sample either. There are actually some presets. So I can just click on these presets here, and it's going to add control points on each of those primaries and secondaries along that control, allowing me now to push them and pull them around. All I need to do is keep a close eye on my vector scope and watch where these go. So red, actually, I don't need to touch. It's already falling straight where it should do, straight into the box. Yellow is actually going in the right direction. Green, you can see it's just slightly kicking off towards yellow, just a little bit. Should be a bit more around there. So I'm going to go to the green control, and I'm just going to pull that. So as I move up, that moves it round towards yellow, and as I move it down, that moves it round towards cyan, and eventually, you do that, I can make that chip do all kinds of weird things. But what I really want it to do is I want it to head straight into the middle of that box where green should live. Cyan, a little bit out. again, I have to stress the reason why it doesn't look like I'm having to do much is because I've got it right in camera. I know I keep going on about this, but this is seconds worth of work of literally tidying up and putting a bow on work that started in production to make sure that it looked right. Blue looks pretty good. Magenta's often the weakest. The reason for that, by the way, if you want to really impress a partner, a dinner party, you can crack out the conversations about debayering image data, raw image data, and the opponent process stage of how it extrapolates the secondary colors from the primary colors values. And everyone will get really excited and applaud you at the end, but it won't. Actually, you'll just be in the corner just quietly sort of looking at your feet. But it is classic that the magenta and the cyan are the weakest. You'll see it across all cameras because those are the colors that are inferred by debayering a color filter array pattern, which is based on red, green, and blue. So you can see I've pulled them round. They are now pointing in the right direction. So let's just take a step back. What does that actually mean? Because at the moment, all that means is some color boxes look the right color. If we pull back from this, go to another scene where the chart's not in it and apply this primary grade to it, we've made sure that the dark blue jacket and the, fuchsia, whatever the color this is, looks exactly the same as it did on the day that it was shot, as close to how it should have looked or as close as that camera can recreate as possible. And those hues pointing in the right direction is job number one, is the most important job. But what we can also do is go to the next one, the hue versus sat, add the same controls, and so that everything is as intense, the hue intensity or saturation is as close to what it should be as possible. I can actually do that as well. So let's put a little bit more saturation into yellow, a little bit more into green. Oh, hello. Let's not do that. A little bit more into cyan. Take a little bit out of blue, because that's a little bit too intense. In fact, if I go back to my hue versus hue, I'm just going to pull blue a little bit further around. And, more or less there, I think. You can see that we're in the boxes, so the colors are right, the saturation is right. All I have to do now is take away that mask, because at the moment that will only be affecting within the mask, but I can lose the mask now. I literally turn it off, and that instantly applies that grade to the whole shot, and it's going to look subtly different. In fact, it's so subtle you can't really see it on the projector. But I am now flicking back and forth between. You can see the node going on and off. If you look at the vector scope, you can actually see the colors pulling around and going. The inherent weakness of this projector, unfortunately, is meaning you can't really see that on the screen. But the vector scope isn't lying; it's showing that correction being applied. And all I have to do now is I just literally right-click on this and grab a still, which essentially encapsulates that grade that I've just done, everything I've just done to correct that primary correction for that shot. And I can now apply that grade to any other shot I had in this scene, essentially. Now let's take away all of the talking. It is genuinely a 60-second process, and it's 100% accurate, whereas the automatic way, the way I showed you first, there is definitely variations on accurate. It's ballpark, but to me, if you're going to go to this level of nerdishness, you may as well get it 100%, So that's how that chart can be used in terms of color. In terms of contrast, if I go back to my waveform monitor, and in fact, let's just look at, let's do Y only for this. Can you see that? Let's brighten it up a bit. There we go. Again, we've got lots of lines all over the place, so it's a bit of a mess. So we just need to isolate what we're after. So what I'm going to do here is go back to this. I'm literally just going to move it across to there. That'll do. Let's hide it again. And you can see now I've now isolated the 90% reflectance chip at the top, and we've got the black, and we've got the mid-gray and dark gray isolated, and I can see them plotted on my waveform monitor. You could also use a histogram if you're more used to using a histogram. For me, a waveform monitor is a far more useful thing in a normal image sense. And that plots it against that, and I can see where it needs to be adjusted. So if I go to my primary wheels, I can actually adjust. I'm not going to adjust. This is probably going too deep, but actually these primary wheels are an RGB adjustment. So if I change contrast in here, it's changing it by adjusting the RGB values. And when you do that, which most programs, that's all they can do, when you do that, it actually has a knock-on effect in terms of saturation. Now, I've just gone and got the saturation exactly right. So if I were to do it in here, I'd then change that. One of the huge benefits of DaVinci Resolve is that it also has a separate Y channel, which you can get access to in the primary bars, which is literally just the next one over. In the primary bars, I can actually make adjustments to brightness completely independently. So it is a pure brightness adjustment, not just a changing of the RGB values. And that won't have any impact on my saturation, which I've just got right. So I'm just going to bring my shadows down so that my black chip is actually falling where it should. And a tip for this, because it can catch you out, is when your subject is holding this and you're recording it in camera, just get them to angle it until you can't see any reflections on this, because this is glossy. And so if you're picking up reflections off the lights, it's going to completely ruin this part. So just tilt it until it looks completely black, and then record it. So I can get that where it's meant to be. My 90% reflectance chip at the top should be slightly higher, and I just need to redistribute the mids a little bit until they're falling broadly in the right place. Let's remove the adjustment, and I've now got, hopefully that'll be a little bit more obvious, you can see the contrast a bit more easily. That is 100% balanced, contrast and color now, completely done. And that can be repeated across any cameras I've got. So if I also had another camera in the room, I could do exactly the same process, and they would look now identical. They would have to. How could they not? I've just gone through and pulled everything, pushed it exactly where it needs to go. So that is a primary balance using the X-Rite chart, which is genuinely something I do on every single shoot for every single interview or any change of scene or any B-roll scene that I'm shooting. And I will go through and I will actually start out my grade by working my way through the charts. There's normally, off a typical 1 or 2 day shoot, I'd probably end up with maybe 10 charts for the type of stuff I shoot. So it's not a vast number. You know, do that 10 times. It's half an hour's work? It's not that long. And then I can use that to then quickly apply to my edit, which will round trip into here from, I use Final Cut 10, but I'm also a Premiere user, so whether I'm using one or the other, I can come in from that program, grade my whole edit using these charts as a primary starting point. And then the next step is then to start to think about how we can isolate certain colors. We have a question. Yes. But yes, I jumped ahead slightly, and well, in other words, I forgot about the contrast. No, you wouldn't grab it twice. Very good point. Unless, of course, you wanted to have two separate, because you can rename these. So I could rename these and have one as the contrast adjustment and one as the color adjustment. There's literally no reason why I'd ever do that I can think of, but I'm trying to make it sound like there was a really good reason why I skipped over it. But I genuinely should have waited. So yeah, let me just delete this one, because that's the one that now contains both. In fact, there's a little icon underneath the node that shows that I've made both a curve adjustment and a brightness adjustment. Yes, so the next stage then is to think about secondary adjustments. What was the light for? There was a question, another question. I'm sorry. If you have a question, just literally shout at me. Ed, was it you with the question? Go ahead. It's a very good question. I'm not dealing with RAW. So the reason you can do that with RAW is because those adjustments are metadata, but I'm actually dealing with the debayed image. This isn't RAW. So what Resolve does, I mean, we're jumping ahead massively, but what Resolve does at the other end once you're finished is it makes you render out brand new clips. And those then replace the ones that you were editing, the ones off the camera, and that's your graded final piece. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I appreciate there's mainly stills people in this room, and this may sound like the longest and most biggest headache in terms of post workflow. I mean, trust me, I wish it was easy as it was with stills. Unfortunately, it isn't. Even if I did have a RAW video camera, like a Red, or if I was shooting Arri RAW, Sony RAW, something like that, although I can make those metadata adjustments in this first tab, it's known as a one light when you do that. It's kind of before a primary. They still ultimately need to be burnt in and rendered into new media, which is then output and connected to your XML, to your edit. So yeah, it's not quite as elegant, I'm afraid. So when you start your secondary work, as I said, your secondary work is isolating certain areas and adjusting them. And this is where the kind of creative element comes in. And for me, this is where things start to get much more interesting as a colorist, because this is where I start to be able to affect how you feel about the film. And so we talked earlier about lighting in certain ways to make people feel a certain way about a certain person. We can also do the same thing with color. So, for example, I'll just quickly chuck this down. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time again. When you're down there watching, it feels like it goes on for ages, but when you're up here, it just disappears. I've got just a shot here. This is actually this is really old now, but this was a student. I was helping out on a shoot with a student, and I quickly just grabbed a shot because it was when the A7S had first come out, and I wanted to see what its S-Log2 handling was like. So I actually just piggybacked on the back of this student's a music video he was doing, and I just grabbed this quick shot. So this is from a Sony A7S, the original. It's S-Log2. I didn't have a chart with me back here. Actually, this was literally years and years ago, before the video chart existed and I even knew about it. So I would have just eyeballed this. But what's interesting about this is we can convey, this had a slightly kind of sort of mythical, ethereal quality to it, this music video. And one of the things that, in terms of coloring, that we could do to change how our viewer feels about the location, about the space that we're in, obviously, we can get our contrast. Let's first of all get our contrast in the kind of the right zone, so that it's not looking all washed out. And let's just increase our saturation as well. But that could be like a primary adjustment, great. But then what I can start to do is I can actually add in additional nodes. So I'm creating a second serial node here, and I can essentially I get a fresh start. I can now build on that. So for example, I could take the greens here, so I'm just going to do a hue versus hue for this. People often jump into the qualifier, by the way. I don't know if you've ever keyed anything, anyone ever done green screen? The qualifier is a bit like that. You can isolate a hue. People tend to jump straight for that to make changes to specific hues, but it's always fiddly and time consuming. The hue versus hue is a much quicker way of doing it. I'm just going to click on that fern there. You can see that's isolated that color for me just with a click, which is very useful. And as before, I can push and pull that up and down. So for example, if I push that up sort of towards sort of these sort of reddy colors, let's just stretch this out so we've got a little bit more. If I go too far this way, I might start getting her skin tone, so I'm going to be careful there. But I could start to just push this into this slightly more sort of autumnal look to it, and I can start to actually change how people feel about this image. Now really, this now is no different from you in Lightroom or Capture One or whatever it would be with a still, for example. You're doing that same level of adjustment and thinking about the colors, just like Adrian did when he had at the end there, where he had them side by side and pushed the blue in. But you're able to do this obviously with a video file, and it will even track motion. So for example, if I wanted to, there might be a better shot actually. I've got a, let's just grab this one. A friend of mine shot this. He does a lot of work with BBC. This was from Match of the Day a couple of years ago. So we've got Gary Lineker here doing a little piece to camera. And you'll see if I quickly draw around his face. So if I wanted to isolate his face and do a secondary correction on here, so let's just say that I wanted to maybe up the, let's just quickly soften that off. If I wanted to just change the contrast a little bit, make it a bit more contrasty, a little bit more saturated. What's great about Resolve is it's got a built-in tracker, so I can actually just track that movement on his face. It's actually a 3D tracker, so you can see as he turns his head, it's a three-dimensional tracker as well. That's where the difference between stills and video really shows itself, because you don't have to do that with stills. And again, I hanker after the simplicity of correcting stills. I love it when I'm correcting stills from my A7R2, and then doing this type of work, it can get incredibly time-consuming. But being able to track and apply masks like that is just another way of isolating a part of the image and allowing you to do something that helps with the viewer. So in this case, adding a bit of saturation to his face, projector's not doing a great job of showing it, but it helps add separation to him from the very similar skin yellowy colours in the building behind him. So actually, if I increase the contrast and saturation of his face and then slightly desaturate the building behind him, what happens is he comes out and the building falls back, and you suddenly create this depth that just wasn't there. And an additional thing that I, in fact, have done with this shot in reality is relit this side of his face, so actually drawn a mask following the contours of his cheekbones, and just darkening it and essentially relighting it, because this was shot outside, it was overcast, very flat light, not very dynamic on the face. You can actually use Resolve to relight and then track that onto his face. So it's an incredibly powerful tool. But the real power comes from knowing what you can do to your image to make your viewer really engage with it and really see and get a sense of the depth of the scene and all the things we talked about with lighting. It's essentially it's a second bite at the apple. You've got, or cherry, whatever the expression is, sorry. It gives you that ability to have a second look and a second chance to fix things. But the pipeline is such that you should be making sure that it's woven into your pre-production, calibrating the monitor, production, using the charts to white balance and capturing a few seconds, and in post-production, building these primary adjustments and creating that consistency across your whole shoot, your whole project.
Thank you very much, Ollie.
Thank you. Thank you very much.